Hey folks, today we're going to go through a video from the channel of Apologia on the subject of the authorship of the Gospels. Folks, this is a must-watch video. It's fantastic. Apologia is interviewing religious studies scholar Dr. Kamil Gregor, who does just a masterful job of laying out the evidence that he uses to make the arguments that he makes. This is, from my point of view, a rarity in the area of religious studies. We're not getting appeals to religious consensus. We're not getting appeals to historians all aligning on a point of view, opinions. We're getting the actual evidence that Dr. Gregor uses to make the arguments that he makes. Now, you'll see I come out in the other direction. I think the evidence is stronger for the case that I'm making, but that's not the point here. This is must watch if you're interested in this subject. Folks, this is what we want. We want the best evidence brought to light. We want the best arguments with the best evidence, because that is how we're going to get to the truth. On this channel, it's not about pushing a particular agenda. It's my point of view that the truth of what is in the Gospels favors the gospel narratives. And for someone who's on their journey seeking and trying to understand, their best chance of getting to that place of understanding is to have the best arguments go head to head, and then for them to see for themselves which arguments prevail. So we're going to go through this video. It's a long video. I'll put chapter markers in it. You might need some time. Maybe put this on in the background while you're cleaning the house or doing something else. But this is a video that is worth getting through and worth hearing the arguments in detail. One point I want to make here is that this is going to be a response video. So we're going to take the arguments from Dr. Gregor more or less as is. We're not making an affirmative case here. We're not making our own case here for the gospel authorship. It's something I'm working on. It's something that I'll do in another video, hopefully in short order. But for this video, it's really important to understand we will be responding. So we will be accepting the arguments as they are. In my view, this is the best way to do response videos. It's not helpful if the responses are nothing but excuses given with weak affirmative arguments put on top of them. What you really want to do with these is accept the arguments as they're presented and then try to rebut them. So specifically accept the evidence that's presented and then try to rebut the evidence, or to try to put a different argument forth for that same set of evidence. So that's what we're going to try to do here. And without further ado, let's launch in.
Last month, I launched a new series on my channel called Holy Book, which will consist of standalone scholarly primers on specific questions about the Bible. The first episode asked, who wrote the Gospels? But while I was working on the finishing touches, Inspiring Philosophy beat me to the punch when he dropped this.
In the first century, were the Gospels entirely anonymous, and only when they were criticized did second-century Christians add names to give them more authority? Or are there good reasons to think the Gospels really did come from Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John?
We've got dueling videos, so put on your flippers and your goggles, because this is going to take a deep dive. Welcome to Apologia, where a former Christian takes a look at the claims of Christians. And today, that's Michael Jones's Who Wrote the Gospel video. Because it's denser than a Christmas fruitcake, it will take a while to unpack. And because I've been in heavy gospel research mode, I was excited when friend of the channel, Kamil Gregor, volunteered to help take up the charge.
All right, let's see it.
According to the consensus of New Testament historians today, there is no reason to think the Gospels were written by the men they were attributed to. Bart Ehrman says, there were some books, such as the Gospels, that had been written anonymously, only later to be ascribed to certain authors, who probably did not write them. Apostles and friends of the apostles, David Carr and Colleen Conway say, all four of the canonical Gospels were originally anonymous. It was only in the 2nd century CE, when the four Gospels were published as a collection, that the superscriptions were added to the Gospels, attributing authorship to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John respectively. Dale Martin says, we believe that all four Gospels were originally published anonymously, and the names they now bear were given to the 4 books later in order to link the books to disciples of Jesus, or close disciples of Jesus.
There's a couple of clarifications that I want to make before we begin. First, it's important to unpack what saying that the 4 canonical Gospels were originally anonymous entails, and to distinguish between several different questions. The question of how Gospel manuscripts were titled is distinct from the question of Gospel authorship. For example, some scholars have held that the Gospel of Mark was actually written by a person named Mark, but it doesn't automatically follow that these scholars also subscribe to any particular theory about who this Mark was. A student of Christian apologist Mike Lacona have recently written a study in which he counted how many biblical scholars believe that the Gospel of Mark was written by Mark and how many believe that Peter is a source behind that Gospel. And those two sets only have a partial overlap. Second, there's a separate question about motivation behind the first usage of the surviving Gospel titles. Michael calls the hypothetical 2nd century editors responsible for them forgers, which entails a malicious intention to deceive. He asks us to believe that they would engage in a sophisticated risk-reward analysis about which apostolic figures should be identified as the authors to maximize the amount of people who would be duped into converting to Christianity. But I advanced a hypothesis that they were not fakers, but they were actually apologists, just like him, and that they were honestly trying to engage in historical speculation to determine who might have written these texts as best as they could. And in this video, I'm going to give you extant examples of ancient Christian writers doing exactly that. And third,
Yeah, so just a minor quibble here. It appears that Dr. Gregor is alleging that it's Michael who is calling the 2nd century historians, who many historians credit as being the first ones to attribute the names as we know them today to the Gospels, as being forgers. I didn't hear it that way. From everything I heard, it seems that Michael is reading the claims made by other modern historians who make those allegations. They don't appear to be the beliefs of Michael. And so we'll set that aside. It's a minor point to quibble. The bigger issue here is Dr. Gregor's point about not necessarily linking the name that appears on a gospel to also being the same as the person who wrote the gospel. His point is that we could have a name that appears in the gospel, and it doesn't necessarily mean that that's also the same person who wrote it. It may seem like an obvious point, but it's something that is worth getting out up front. We should separate the two when we're doing the analysis, and if we are trying to show that they're linked, we're going to need to establish both elements of that the name is the right name and that it is the person who actually authored the gospel. So just keep that in mind as we move forward here.
exactly that. And third, I should point out that I personally don't have any issue with the idea that the traditional gospel writers actually were literary authors of some sorts of texts. This is paradoxically a product of sort of a horseshoe theory of biblical scholarship. See, I don't think there is a particularly good reason to believe that, for example, Peter or John actually were fishermen from rural Galilee, and that actually eliminates a lot of the arguments against them being literary authors. I can totally see that Mark, a translator for Peter, wrote down Peter's preachings that he remembered, which would be a text that we no longer have, that Matthew wrote down a collection of dominical oracles, something like Q, that John is the author of a text that was eventually incorporated into the Gospel of John, or that there was a now lost account of Paul's travels written down by his actual companion in the first person, and that's where the so-called we passages in canonical Acts came from. I also have no issue accepting external authorial attestation, even if it's relatively late. For example, in the early 5th century, Pope Innocent I wrote that a book known as Acts of Andrew was written by philosophers Xenocharides and Leonidas. I agree with scholars who think this is correct, and so I believe that the Acts of Andrew do have known authors.
All right, so when we hear the scholarly argument that the Gospels circulated anonymously originally, it's important to understand the nuance in that argument because it doesn't always come out. And Dr. Gregor is providing some of that to us here. So one of the first things is his concession that he does not necessarily exclude the possibility that the Gospels could have been originally written by people with the names that are currently assigned to them. That's not excluded from his argument. To be clear, he's not arguing that that's true, but what he's saying is that his thesis doesn't exclude that possibility. The second and really important concession here is that he is not per se opposed to the notion that even a later attribution couldn't mean that the attribution is correct. In other words, he's saying that just because an attribution may come late doesn't necessarily mean that the attribution is wrong. Again, these things may seem really obvious, but they're important points for us as we're moving through with our analysis. Because as we're going to see here, there's a third point and a third concession here that I'm going to just take out of order from the video, just so we can focus on it here up front with this. There's no trick to this, but it's just, it fits better in this portion of the analysis, and we'll come back to it in context so you can see it later. And that has to do with the notion that when scholars like Dr. Gregor argue that the gospel circulated anonymously, they're not arguing that no one at any point in time ever knew who the original author was. This is a critical point because I think a lot of times the rebuttals that are given and the assumptions that are made, including the assumptions that I make, is that they're alleging that no one ever knew who wrote these from the outset. As you'll see here in the next clip here, that is not the argument that is advanced by at least Dr. Gregor.
It by murdering him, but because it wasn't exactly possible to incite him to a political assassination openly, scrolls with political slogans started conspicuously showing up in places where Brutus was likely to randomly find them. These scrolls were turbo-anonymous. Nobody, apart from their writers, not even their moms, knew who wrote them. No scholar proposes that the Gospels were originally anonymous like that. Of course, there were initially people who knew who the Gospel authors were, just like there were people who initially knew who wrote the Epistle to the Hebrews. What's your point? Of course, there were people who knew who wrote the Didache or the letter to Diognetus. We don't. That happens all the time. What I'm arguing is that already in mid-2nd century, Christians had no better idea about who wrote the 4 Gospels than we do today, just like they didn't know who wrote Hebrews.
This acknowledgement by Dr. Gregor is so important, so critical, that we need to discuss it now and keep it in mind as we move through the rest of the analysis. Because Dr. Gregor is not arguing that at the time the Gospels were written, the author was unknown. In fact, he's conceding that when whoever, we'll just say hypothetically for now, the person was that wrote Matthew, let's say the person's name was Matthew, when Matthew wrote down what ultimately became the Gospel of Matthew, it was known to Matthew and at least to the people who were copying it and some small circle of people outside of that who it was that wrote the account. This is so important because the argument that Dr. Gregor is going to make here is that at some point over time, that knowledge was forgotten. That has to be the argument in order for us to reach the 2nd century and no longer remember any better than we do today who the original author was. But as we'll see as we go through, the foundation for that is really not laid, and in fact it's the harder of the two positions in my view to take. It's the more strained assessment of the evidence. If we're conceding that up front the writer and a small circle of people at least knew who the writer was. And you'll see this point's important for some other points that we make later. But if we're conceding that the writer and a small circle of people knew who the writer was, and that these documents were continued to be copied and exchanged and circulated over time, it's the more strained interpretation that as that circulation and as that copying took place, that people started forgetting who the writer was. There is an argument, and I want to be fair here to Dr. Gregor, there is an argument that it could have been forgotten, but it's the more strained of the two hypotheticals. One is that the writer was originally known, everyone knew who it was in this small circle, and as time went on, that circle expanded and the Gospels were exchanged, and as the Gospels were exchanged and circulated, the one hypothesis is that they were saying, hey, this is that gospel that that guy Matthew wrote. Okay? The other hypothesis is that as time went on and as the circle expanded and the gospel was copied, they said, hey, here's that gospel that, has become pretty popular, but we don't remember anymore who wrote it, or we're unsure. At least between the two hypotheticals, and again, I'm being a little simplistic here, but at least between those two hypotheticals, it's far more credible that if it's conceded that it was known up front who wrote the gospel, that knowledge would have been maintained as the gospel gained authority throughout the region. So I think that's an important point we want to get out here up front, because what this means is that at least at the earliest dates of the gospels, they didn't circulate anonymously, at least as the way it's come to be understood in sort of the common parlance. People knew, at least originally, who wrote the accounts. They knew who the writers were. And so we'll talk about the names attached to the Gospels, the attributions, the according to attributions. We'll talk about those later. And for now, we'll just accept the argument that those attributions were not on the original Gospels. Again, we're just accepting the argument as given to us here by Dr. Gregor. We'll talk about it later. Even if the attributions were not on the original documents that circulated, the according to Matthew, according to Mark, attributions were not on the original document that circulated, that does not mean that as they were circulated, the people who were circulating them didn't know who originally wrote them.
You have known authors.
One of the reasons the traditional authorship of the Gospels is denied is because none of them internally mention an author, either in the preface or main body. Thus, the Gospels are by definition internally anonymous. But that doesn't mean they ever circulated without names attached to them. In 2019, Simon Gathercole wrote an important paper where he points out a lack of claim of authorship internally is entirely irrelevant to the question of the Gospel's anonymity. The reason being is many ancient works were also internally anonymous. In fact, Elmer Herkomer noted that this practice of an author leaving their name out of the body of their work was the standard norm. If we look specifically at the genre of ancient Greco-Roman biographies, of which the Gospels fit nicely with, we can see it was common to write biographies internally anonymous. Thus, given this survey, Gathercole says, the absence of the evangelist names should excite no comment at all. Such an absence is not remotely a curious feature. In other words, given the cultural context, we should expect the Gospels to be internally anonymous. And so the argument the Gospels do not internally identify the authors is not actually evidence they were known as anonymous works.
I thought it would be nice to start with a point of agreement and acknowledge that when it comes to this specific aspect of the debate, Michael and the scholars he's citing are absolutely correct. Michael references an article in which Simon Gathercole responds to several scholars who think that a strict internal anonymity of the Gospels, meaning the Gospel authors never explicitly identify themselves by name in the text, is surprising. This is a good opportunity to highlight that there is no division between Christian scholars and so-called skeptics. To my knowledge, all the scholars who are referenced by Gathercole as subscribing to gospel anonymity are practicing Christians. And one of the reasons they give for why the Gospels were written anonymously is that this was a way for the authors to indicate that they were merely working as wills of the Holy Spirit. For example, Kurt Oland wrote, "In my opinion, it is beyond doubt that all the Gospels were published anonymously. Our present opinion about their authors dates from information which derives from the time of Papias or later. Kurt Oland has a gravestone with a huge inscription which literally says Hic expectat resurrectionem, or here he awaits the resurrection." As I mentioned, Gathercole correctly points out that an ancient history or biography, which is what he uses as comparanda to the Gospels, failing to explicitly name its author in the text is no indication of whether the author was identified by name in the title of the work or not. That being said, the list of specifically ancient Greek and Latin historians and biographers who do positively identify themselves by their name in the text is quite a bit longer than what Gathercole reports. For example,
We should pause here because there's at least some small amount of conflation that's happening here. Again, I think it's not coming from Dr. Gregor, but the point is that the issue of whether or not the Gospels circulated anonymously we can no longer use that phrase generically. We have to describe what we mean when we're making that argument now. So Anonymously could be no one knew at the time that the text was circulating who wrote it. That's one argument. Number two could be within the document itself, there was no identification of who wrote it. That's point number two. Point number three could be there was no attribution according to Mark, according to Matthew, attribution on the text. And so when scholars are using, as we've discussed, when scholars are using this term anonymously, they don't always mean the same thing. And so even when we're referencing portions of scholarly works that are discussing anonymity, we have to be very clear about what exactly it is we're talking about. As we've already established, the Gospels were at least originally known by the writer and a small group of people. It was at least originally known who the writer was, at least to the writer and amongst a small group of people. With respect to the notion that the Gospels contained the attributions, that's something that will need to be established. So put that aside. And then I think we have to concede, and it's important to concede, that within the Gospel text, at the very least, Mark and Matthew, there is no identification of who the writer was or that they had access to eyewitness testimony. That's an important point here that we must concede before we move forward. However, it is worth noting that the argument that we're talking about with respect to sort of lack of identification of eyewitnesses only applies to Mark and Matthew. It doesn't apply to Luke, and it doesn't apply to John. If we want to separate out Matthew and Mark from Luke, we're going to need a good reason why we need to pull the three of them apart, because there's as scholars have long argued, there's literary dependence between those three Gospels, the Synoptics. And then as far as dating and everything else, it's another conversation, but we're going to have to get some good argument as to why we should meaningfully remove Luke from the, presumably earlier dating of Matthew and Mark. Okay, but let's just even set that aside for now. Let's actually even concede that Luke is later, and significantly later, with respect to this argument. Again, we're going to accept the argument, the implication as it's given to us. Let's accept that. The next point here is the issue of whether or not we should be surprised that, at least within the text of the gospel itself, there's no identification of the writer, and at least within the text of Mark and Matthew, there's no acknowledgement of any eyewitnesses. And we should ask ourselves whether we should be surprised by that. And we're going to discuss this a little bit more as we go forward, but I think it's worth putting out there now that there is an argument that besides the arguments that are going to be made here, that shouldn't be surprising given the concession that we got earlier about knowledge of who wrote the Gospels, at least originally. And so, again, we're not advancing an affirmative theory here. We're not, making an argument. What we're saying is when an argument's presented to us and we're responding to it, it's important for us to point out if other possibilities have been eliminated or not. Because if they haven't, then we don't have an obligation to concede them. And so, in this case, there's certainly a credible story that again, assuming these events are true, again, assuming that this is not, some creative writer's fictitious imagination, decades after the alleged events, assuming this, the accounts as sort of articulated in the Gospels are based on something that happened, and assuming that the writer of the original accounts was known, that writer likely came from the group of people who would have known about this, okay? And so the writer would have been writing and drawing, the stories and accounts and quotes and everything else from the circle of people who would have known about this. And we'll just argue for now, concede for now, that circle was really small. Okay, so with if say hypothetically some guy named Matthew, okay, maybe the apostle, maybe someone else, was part of this early small circle and said, okay, I'm going to write this stuff down. I'm going to write the things down that we've been hearing about and talking about, and it's been carried in our tradition, and it was known amongst a small group of people who that person was. Then the question would be, would it be necessary to say to that group of people, I have eyewitnesses? Would if the account is being written at this time for that small group of people, would it be necessary to identify within the text, hey, I Matthew, you guys already know who I am. I'm writing this, or say, hey, I'm Matthew, and I have witnesses to this. Now, I think it's a totally valid argument to say that it should be there, and it should be expected to be there, especially if we place the Gospels in the genre that Dr. Gregor places them into, and we'll get to that. But we can't just exclude the possibility that the reasonable possibility, again, we don't have to entertain every possibility, but a reasonable possibility, which is that this small circle already knew who this was and didn't have any need to establish any kind of authority or to establish any kind of sort of eyewitness validation. They already knew who it was and already knew the stories. In fact, they were the ones who helped contribute to them. There's an additional argument about the need to sort of preserve reverence or modesty, etc. I'll touch on it a little bit. I'll be honest, I'm not the best person to do the analysis there. They're scholars who are experts who are, and this is the kind of thing that scholars are, better than lay people at sort of assessing whether or not the need for modesty may have been a reason why at least in Mark and Matthew, there's no identification of who the author was. I can't really advance that argument. I can't do much with it, so I just want to put it out there as for completeness that's also an argument that's advanced here. And so again, if we're contemplating a small hypothetical community where the people in that community knew about the events, and for now we will hypothesize that someone in that community was able to write Greek. Okay, we'll leave the Hebrew issue aside, Hebrew Matthew aside for a moment. We'll assume that someone in that community was able to write Greek. It's actually, this is a good point to just get out up front. It's not responsive to the main argument to argue that it wasn't or was Matthew himself who literally put the sort of reed to papyrus. And to his credit, Dr. Gregor here doesn't argue that. At least for me and many others, when I say Matthew wrote X, what I'm saying is that the source material came from Matthew. Maybe as one who was literate enough himself to write an account, again, saying Hebrew or Greek or whatever. Maybe from his oral testimony that was written down by someone else in the small community who was literate, again, in whatever language. And so if we're arguing and that there was a small group of people who knew who wrote this, it doesn't necessarily have to have been Matthew himself, the apostle, who wrote the event down. And then now, if we're talking about this small group of people, and there's someone else in the group who, hey, the genius guy in the group who can speak multiple languages and can write, he's an amazing writer. He wrote that other thing earlier. Let's have him write this down. You could easily see how within that small group there would be no reason to say, amongst the group he's writing the account to and for, hey, this came from Matthew. Hey, we have eyewitnesses to this. Especially if this writer was one of the eyewitnesses. So again, an eyewitness outside of Matthew. So I want to be really clear. I'm not advancing this as a theory. I'm saying this is the kind of thing that has to be excluded from an argument if we're going to say it's difficult to imagine that why a writer of Mark or Matthew wouldn't identify themselves within the text. Just imagine this sort of really simple, silly hypothetical where there is a car accident and John, Sally, and Susie are there, but none of them is literate. None of them can write anything down. In addition to John, Sally, and Susie, there's also their genius friend who can write, Bobby. But Bobby wasn't at the event. However, John, Sally, and Susie tell Bobby what happened, and Bobby decides to write it down. And Bobby says John was driving, saw the car go by, Susie screamed, Sally called the police. You could see that being written by this person, Bobby, who wasn't there, but because he's writing this account for this small group of people, he doesn't need to identify that he's the writer. He doesn't need to identify that he got this from witnesses. Doesn't need to identify himself in any way. And I want to again triple emphasize, this is not even a theory. This is just the type of thing that has to be excluded from possibility before we just concede that these omissions, which are true, are inexplicable. Because again, continuing with this sort of silly hypothetical, if this document written by Bobby now goes on to be copied and published, you could see how people would say before they started copying, okay, where did this come from? And he says, hey, this came from John, Susie, and Sally. And then perhaps then or several years later, when there's a need to sort of disambiguate, you could see them saying this is the account according to John or according to Susie or according to Sally or according to all three. And that may have been there from the beginning or may not have been. So again, I want to get off this hypothetical because it's not really the point. The point here is to acknowledge that we have to eliminate these kinds of possibilities before we can really sit here and express any real shock about what we're finding.
For example, he doesn't include Appian of Alexandria for some reason, but much more importantly, explicit identification of the author by their name in the text was perfectly common in ancient Christian biographies. You might think that Catechol doesn't include them because they post-date the Gospels, but that can't be the case, because he also discusses biographies written by late ancient philosopher Porphyry, who is contemporary or even later than some of these Christian biographies. There are at least 8 extant ancient Christian biographies in which the author explicitly identifies himself by his name in the text, in some cases more than once. You can see the subjects of the biographies and the authors on screen. But what's important is not that, for example, the author of the Gospel of Mark doesn't say, "As for my name, it is Mark, a disciple of Peter." It's that the author never acknowledges that he has access to eyewitness testimony in any way. Some biblical scholars and all Christian apologists want to place the canonical Gospels into the same category of literature as ancient Greco-Roman historiographical works. They want to say that Mark or Matthew fundamentally pursued the same literary project and conducted similar historical investigation as Thucydides or Tacitus. But ancient historians and biographers, of course, do proactively and explicitly state that they have access to eyewitness testimony, either their own or of their sources, when they do. To illustrate how common this was, I put together a collection of passages from ancient histories and biographies, in which the author talks about himself and about his access to eyewitness testimony. I only selected one passage per author, and yet there's still way too many examples for us to go over. So I'm just going to keep talking, and the video will move through the passages in a slideshow. Feel free to pause it to read any given passage. The examples I collected cover both Greek and Latin authors, both historiographers and biographers, both Jewish and non-Jewish authors, and they in fact cover almost the entire canon of surviving Greco-Roman historical and biographical works. Additionally, there are several lost historians whose works only survive in fragments, and yet we still have it attested that they identified themselves as eyewitnesses in their lost works. And again, ancient Christian historians and biographers also explicitly state access to eyewitness testimony when they have it. This practice was so common that we have even examples of fictional eyewitnesses or even fictional historians who function as eyewitnesses. There are some known counterexamples, but those exist for reasons that are not applicable to the Gospels. The only ancient narrative works in which the authors are as silent as the authors of the Gospel of Mark and Matthew are works which have no access to eyewitness testimony. For example, works describing very distant past, like histories of the foundation of Rome, or very late biographies of poets, which are often largely built from autobiographical statements in the poet's own works, or works of historical fiction, for example, the Alexander Romance, or various lives of Aesop, or some ancient novels. It's difficult to overstate how significant this observation is for the question of gospel authorship. Greco-Roman historians and biographers who conduct actual historical investigation and who do have access to eyewitness testimony consistently write entirely differently from how Mark or Matthew are written. This is the real problem of gospel anonymity. If the Gospels followed the same literary practices as ancient historiography, we would absolutely expect the Gospel of Mark to say, "And Jesus saw Simon, who gave this testimony," or the Gospel of Matthew to say, "And he saw a man named Matthew, the author of this account." Explicit declaration of eyewitness testimony is of course also very common in later Christian apocrypha. We know of some 20 ancient apocryphal works in which the author explicitly communicates access to eyewitness testimony in the text. You can see their titles on the screen. So why is it the case that these writings conform to what we expect to see in Greco-Roman historiography better than two of the canonical Gospels? Well, it's because they were written later, at a time when it became important to establish apostolic authority. It's not surprising that it's precisely the two earliest Gospels, Mark and Matthew, that make absolutely no mention of having access to eyewitness testimony. It's only later writings that protest too much and start saying things like, "I, Simon Peter, and Andrew, my brother, took our nets and went to the sea," or "The man who saw it has given testimony, and his testimony is true. He knows that he tells the truth, and he testifies so that you may also believe," and stuff like that.
Okay, so this is a good place to pause because I think the claim as put forth by Dr. Gregor here is a bit of a straw man. I'm not really entirely putting it on him, but this is one of those things where even if the claim is true that most or all apologists want to place the Gospels in the genre of historical biography, and for now we'll accept that argument, the claim as presented here is overstated. The significance of that claim is overstated because what most apologists, at least as I understand them, are actually claiming is that the accounts as articulated and narrated in the Gospels are historical. So most of these same apologists also claim that these accounts are scriptural and divinely inspired and several other things. Again, I have reasons to believe that. I'm not arguing that. It's not relevant to the argument here, but I will say that those same apologists would not make those arguments for Lives of Illustrious Men or any other type of document. And so it's really important here that if we're going to make the claim that this is what apologists argue, which is fine, we just have to make sure we don't overstate the claim. For whatever it's worth, I'll go ahead and just state my personal position on this, which may or may not have any value to you because I'm not a religious scholar, and I'm actually really not even that good of an apologist, and I think I have a kind of a slightly different take on just the whole way to approach this subject matter. But be that as it may, I'll say that my point of view is that the Gospels are reciting historical events. They are writing down and characterizing events that happened. And they're, and that's the primary purpose of what they were, is to say, hey, let's get down to things that we recall as we remember them. Let's get them down, on papyrus. That's my point of view. There are additional purposes to the Gospels, again, especially for those who hold that they're divinely inspired, the Word of God. I don't discount that. I've said elsewhere on other videos, I'm open to that, and it's actually my personal belief. It's idiosyncratic to me, right? I believe that, but I don't argue that, and I don't build arguments based upon that, because I don't find those arguments will be persuasive, again, to the group of people that I am trying to reach here. And they're certainly not going to be persuasive to the skeptic. And so the where I will kind of dig in a bit is that it's certainly difficult to separate out completely the fact that the writers of these texts, again, if we assume these accounts are based on real events, had beliefs about the significance and the importance of the events they were writing down beyond just, hey, we're just going to write the facts down as they were. I think that would be a stretch to argue. I wouldn't make that argument. I think it would be a tough argument to make if you were trying to advance that. So, again, that would be different than, say, a Jerome who's writing an account, or a Tacitus, or a Josephus. I think it would be fair. I think everyone who's fair about this would concede that there may be different additional motivations. And so just simply saying these texts belong in the category of historical biography, I think is simultaneously saying too little and also saying too much. I'll just leave it there for now. Hopefully that point's made and we can move on. So this analysis here by Professor Gregor, again, I've not gone and independently verified that. I've argued to you all, and it's been the approach that I've taken myself, is that I always go and verify the evidence that's being given to me, independently verify it, fact check it, make sure that it's true. I'm going to concede that it's true here, and I'll go a step further just so that it's super clear. I have no reason to believe that Dr. Gregor is trying to pull any fast ones here. In fact, I'm so impressed with him that his credibility just kind of jumps off the screen to me here. So I'm accepting everything he's putting forth as being true. I will at some point in time go back and dig in, but it really doesn't even change the argument significantly if this little nit or that little nit is off. What he's saying here has to be conceded. If you're going to argue that the Gospels belong in the same genre as these other texts that Professor Gregor is laying out here, then you do have to deal with the very real problem that the Gospels do not identify either the author internally, nor the fact that the accounts are being drawn from eyewitnesses. That's just impossible to get away from. I have no interest in making that argument. It's an argument that's got to be conceded. And so Dr. Gregor does. This is like one of the reasons why I just really, really, really love this video, love this presentation, because Dr. Gregor is hitting hard here, and he's bringing really good evidence that has to be dealt with. It can't be hand-waved away, can't be pushed away. It's not fair to those of us who are trying to get to the truth to just shove it away. Now, with that said, I am going to go back to the earlier point, which is that I think it's trying to claim too much to isolate the Gospels, to treat the Gospels as being, exactly in the category of historical biography. I think it would be conceded, again, I don't want to put words in Dr. Gregor's mouth, I think it would be conceded by most historians that whatever the Gospels are, whatever they are a unique genre. They can be broadly put into broader genres, but whatever the Gospels are, they are unique amongst documents from that period of time. particularly we're talking about the canonical Gospels. We can make some arguments about the apocryphal Gospels. And actually, it's worth pointing out here that references to the apocryphals and the apocryphals containing accounts of being from witnesses and everything else, I think is an argument that cuts both ways. I don't think that argument is necessarily in the plus column for the argument that Dr. Gregor is advancing. I think part of the problem with the later Gospels, like the apocryphals, one of the reasons why they were never deemed authoritative, for amongst many other reasons, is actually specifically because of that. And that argues both ways. That argues both ways. That does give some credence to the fact that those who were looking at these put some importance on the fact that there was no identification in the earlier accounts. Again, we can quibble about that, but I think that argument does not, in my view, help one side or the other. And so, getting back to the issue generally, even when we include the later Gospels and apocryphals, I think it's fair to say, and I'm going to assume this is not disputed, but to be safe, I'll say that I'd imagine this is the widely held view, is that whatever the Gospels are, they're unique in ancient history as far as documents go. They're unique. I think even the arguments made by Dr. Gregor pretty much concede that, because he's saying, unlike other historical biographies, the Gospels don't have these certain features that we'd expect to find. That pretty much admits the point. And I think, more to the issue here, the scriptural element and the doctrinal elements, etc. Again, the belief of divine inspiration and all of that goes into the Gospels really placed them in a unique category. So I don't want that to appear to be a cop-out, but there's only so far we're going to be able to go by doing just a one-to-one comparison with other historical biographies. I think that would be conceded. I don't imagine that Dr. Gregor would strenuously push back on that. I think what he's doing here is saying, hey, look, you apologists are the ones who argue that these are historical biographies. Let me tell you why it's not. He just crushes that. That absolutely annihilates that. And I think if you're going to stick rigidly to that position, you lost on that point. So we'll move on here. Just FYI, for the interest of time, I did skip some of the more detailed analysis that Dr. Gregor puts forth here, because I think this point has to be conceded. This is an absolute, totally nailed point by Dr. Gregor, has to be conceded. And if you want to watch the entire video, which again, it's must watch, you go back, I'll put the link in the description, you can go watch it. And so to close out this particular part of the analysis, Dr. Gregor argues that the reason why the later Gospels, including the apocryphals, and potentially even Luke and John, the reason why those Gospels contain references to witnesses, some identification, for example, in the Gospel of John, that it's written by an eyewitness, is because at that point in time there was a need to establish authority, and in the case of the Gospels, apostolic authority for the text. That's the theory that he puts forth. We don't have to credit that. Again, accepting the argument that's given to us, there's some other explanations here that have not been eliminated. So one is, again, that Luke could have been earlier. These arguments, to the extent they apply to John, are much harder to make when it comes to Luke. Luke is a special case, and it will be talked about a little bit later. So just on that point alone, there's a distinction. Again, if you want to push Luke into the 2nd century, as some do, then maybe you can make this argument there. I think that is the far, 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 far weaker analysis of Luke when it comes to dating. But if that's where you are, then maybe this analysis holds up. But if not, if you push Luke toward the 60s, where at least Luke Acts ends in terms of referencing any historical events, then this argument becomes difficult with respect to Luke, because Luke expressly says that part of the basis of his writing is the reliance on eyewitness accounts. And significantly, just on this last point with respect to Luke, the corpus of the Gospel of Luke, after the preamble, mirrors the same structure as Mark and Matthew. Again, and the argument is that Luke copied this, relevant portions from Mark and potentially Matthew, and or maybe from Q. Again, we won't get into that here, but the argument that most scholars, and I think most in the field across the spectrum, concede and believe, is that there's a literary dependence between Luke and Matthew and Mark. The parts that are literary dependent, the actual sort of body of the gospel itself, again, doesn't contain any reference within that of who wrote it. Also, in the preamble to Luke, it doesn't state, I, Luke, am writing this. From my perspective, that cuts in favor of the argument that that we shouldn't read too much into the omissions here, because Luke had the opportunity. If Luke has been identified as a gospel that felt the need to demonstrate the eyewitness nature of it, Luke did that up front, and then he would have had the opportunity to state within the text, this comes from Luke, I, Luke, am writing this, behold the account of Luke the physician at the end, and he didn't do that. And so there again, not advancing a theory here, not really, it's difficult when you're listening to rebuttals to understand when there's an actual affirmative theory being advanced and when there's excuses being made and trying to hand wave away things, and when there's actual responsiveness there. And maybe people can argue that I'm doing some of the other things, but what I can say here is that we have to exclude the possibility, the very real possibility that, especially given the facts that we have, that there was not some other reason not to identify yourself within the text. I think there was a lot of negatives there, so let me try this again. We have to exclude the possibility that identifying yourself within the text was something that was undesirable for whatever reason. And that's why Luke didn't do it also, even though Luke felt the need to put the references to the eyewitnesses up front. I don't think this argument strongly cuts in favor of the position that Dr. Gregor is advancing. I won't argue that it necessarily cuts in the sort of apologetic direction either, but this is not persuasive from my point of view in really in either direction. And if I had to really sort of pick a position, I think it's more persuasive, especially when we bring in Luke, that the failure to reference the writer within the body of the text itself had some additional significance. And so, are we obligated on this record to accept the position that the reason why the later documents, and again we'll add Luke into that, in the rebuttal case we're making, why the later documents included these references to witnesses and in the apocryphals, identified the author, are we obligated to assume that the reason for that was because at that point in time there was a need to establish authority? I don't think so. I don't think the case is made for that at all. And in fact, the fact that somewhere in the near future from this point in time, there was a rejection of all those other documents by the authorities in the burgeoning church, it's an indication again that that type of thing, however valuable it may have been in other contexts, was not valuable to those who were putting the canon together. And additionally, there's reason to believe that those who were putting the canon together felt that those inclusions cast doubt on the veracity and the authenticity of those documents. So I don't think this argument foundation is laid well enough for us to sit here and say the reason must be that because that this happened because there was a need to establish authority. Again, I don't want to put that entirely into Dr. Gregor's mouth because I don't think he's advancing his theory, but I don't think he's arguing that that's the only way to read the data. And just to be clear here and for completeness, we can wrap up this particular discussion point. I'm not arguing that the reason why the other documents, apocryphals, etc., were rejected is because necessarily they had these other elements. I think it is still available to us as a credible option. Nothing has been established yet to suggest otherwise. It's still available to us as a credible option that the reason why those other texts were rejected is because already by that time they were not authoritative. Already by that time people knew which ones were authoritative and they knew where they came from. We've not done anything yet to discredit that. So we know that was known originally, and nothing has yet been established to show us why that would have been forgotten. Okay, so enough on that, and we'll move on.
Historians who function as eyewitnesses. There are some known counterexamples, but those exist for reasons that are not applicable to the Gospels. Julius Caesar refers to himself in the third person in his commentary, except for one passage, and Xenophon apparently wrote his Anabasis under a pseudonym. In both cases, this is because they are the main characters, and their works continuously describe their own military victories and other accomplishments, so it would be perceived as too self-congratulatory for them to constantly refer to their successes in the first person. This would only be comparable to the Gospels if they were written by Jesus himself. There are also some fragments of lost histories in which the author refers to himself in the third person. For example, 3rd century general Herennius Dexippus. But because we don't have their works preserved, we don't know whether the author identified himself elsewhere in the text, just like, for example, Polybius.
So I just want to go back to a portion that I cut out earlier. Accidentally, I didn't mean to cut it out where I did. We're going to talk about it here. It doesn't really make a difference what order we deal with these arguments in. And it refers to the biography of Julius Caesar, which was purportedly written by Julius Caesar, in which Julius Caesar refers to himself in the third person throughout, and doesn't identify that he's the one who's writing the document. The argument that's being put forth for why that's different from the Gospels is that Julius Caesar was recounting accounts of triumph and success, and it would have been too self-congratulatory to name himself as the person who was writing it. I, Julius Caesar, am writing these things. And the argument is that that doesn't apply to the Gospels because the Gospels weren't written by Jesus. If Jesus was the one who's purported to have written the Gospels, then it would be deemed too self-congratulatory in that context. But since they were purported to be written by eyewitnesses or others, then it doesn't apply. I think that argument is a stretch. I actually think the argument is stronger in the other direction. And what I mean by that is that at least if you take the purported history of Matthew, for example, or Mark as an interpreter of Peter, it would be difficult to see how those writers would not also feel that including themselves would be deemed too self-inflating. So if you take Mark, for example, Mark is writing, on behalf of Peter. If we just accept that history, again, there's quibbles about that. That's not the point here. But if it's Peter's words that is being written down in Mark, to say, I, Peter, witnessed these things, and I, Peter, was a part of these things, and the types of stuff that show up in that gospel, you could easily apply the same argument to that. The Peter may say, look, I'm not big enough of a deal to be featured here. This is about Jesus. I don't want this to be about me. I don't want the focus to be on me. Again, I'm not arguing this. I'm not saying this is what it is, but to say that argument with respect to Caesar can't apply here, I think really overstates it. I think the argument is stronger in the other direction. Same with Matthew. Again, if it's Matthew who is writing a witness account, or a witness account is being written on behalf of Matthew. Again, I've given other potential things that we can exclude with respect to how these accounts could have been written, but with respect to Matthew, if it's I, Matthew, witness these things, again, you could see how Matthew could say, that's featuring me. That's putting me in a place of prominence. It's not about me. I want to focus on the other stories. I want to emphasize Jesus, etc. If that argument works and is applicable to Caesar, which I'm not disputing, then it should work equally well here. And it's not distinguished on the fact that on the one hand, it was Caesar himself who was purporting to be writing, and in this case, we'd have to analogize that to Jesus. I don't think that argument works. I think this is one of the weaker arguments in the presentation by Dr. Gregor. So I just wanted to touch on that. We can move on from it now. There is a much more impactful argument that we have to deal with here, and that is the argument with respect to whether or not these accounts are eyewitness accounts, any of them. Again, remember, the broad question that we're trying to answer with all of this, including authorship, is any of this true? Did this happen? And certainly it is more difficult to accept as being true if there are no eyewitnesses. I don't want to say that it eliminates the possibility of truth. I think that goes way too far. And Professor Gregor already conceded that he doesn't even necessarily hold that position as by itself making that claim. But in this set of circumstances, the question still is, okay, are any of these accounts, even if true, even if otherwise true, written by eyewitnesses, and how can we know? And I think that's a very fair question given the evidence put forth here by Dr. Gregor. To really do this justice, we have to deal with Luke. We can no longer continue to separate out and parse out Luke from Mark and Matthew, because Luke expressly says he is relying on eyewitness testimony, that's part of what he used to generate his accounts. That Luke says that. So it's, again, it could be a lie, it could be a puffery to try to puff up the validity of what he was writing. Those are certainly arguments, but the better argument here, I think we have to just, if we're going to be fair, the better argument here is that Luke did draw upon testimony from eyewitnesses and accounts from eyewitnesses. It's the far better read of the record. And again, this isn't that hard to imagine. If these events happened, there would have been eyewitnesses. So really the only rebuttal here is that these events never happened and it was all made up. And again, if that's where we are, then it's just a different conversation. There's no point in really even digging into anything we're doing here. So we're just going to put that to the side for now. And so the other argument would be that, look, maybe these events did happen, but by the time they were written, including by Luke, it was far after the event had taken place. And even when Luke references eyewitnesses, it's puffery, or it's some other less than entirely truthful accounting of what happened. Again, we can argue that, and to be fair, we can't exclude that on the record here. However, that is the weaker argument on the record. We just don't have the basis with what's been given to us to definitively say that's the better argument. We just don't. If these events really happened, and if Luke was writing about these events in a time period where he could have had access to people who would have been witnesses to those events, then there is this issue of lack of eyewitness testimony, or lack of clear statements from eyewitnesses really dissolves. It goes away. And then that leaves us with Matthew and Mark. We'd have to ask ourselves if it's possible that Luke had access to eyewitnesses. And for now, the argument we're presenting, we're arguing that that is possible, then it is certainly no less possible that the earlier Matthew or Mark would have also had access to witnesses, or may have even themselves been witnesses. So, to be fair to Dr. Gregor here, we cannot say definitively that, yes, there were eyewitnesses and it's definitive and it's proven. We can't argue that. We can't argue that any of these events happened with 100% historical certainty. B, if these events did happen, that eyewitnesses to those events are the ones who are recounting their memories in the Gospels. C, that if the accounts are removed from eyewitnesses, that they're still somehow otherwise reliably recorded, even if it's many years later. We can't argue any of those with 100% certainty. However, the better argument, and that's what we're trying to do here, the better argument, the more likely than not argument, is that these events happened. Again, we go back to even the concessions from scholars who are skeptical that Jesus really did exist, and that he had followers, and that he preached, and that he was crucified. So there would have been witnesses to that. And the question is, could those witnesses have generated the accounts that we see here, as between the possibility of those witnesses generating an account and the possibility that they didn't? I think the better argument, even if it's slightly, is that those witnesses did generate an account. And why is it better? Because Luke says they did. And again, that wouldn't otherwise by itself be persuasive, but the author of Luke says that he got this from eyewitnesses, and we don't have any inherent reason, certainly no intrinsic reason to question that. And even within the context of the arguments made by Professor Gregor here, Luke falls within the norms and the expectations of historiography or historical bibliography. Luke does fall within them, because Luke states that he got his material from eyewitnesses.
And Matthew. But if the Gospels are not based on eyewitness testimony, this pattern of initial absence and later presence of eyewitness claims in the four Gospels is entirely unsurprising, and it fits exactly into the development of early Christian literature.
But what of the claim that the four Gospels were not attributed to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John until the 2nd century? Well, there are many reasons to think their titles were actually original. First, the Gospels would have needed to be identified when copies were added to private library collections of the various churches. So it is likely they came with some form of external title to identify them, just as it was the case with other ancient works.
Here we have not just one, but two false dichotomies. First, a title was not the only means of identifying an ancient work. Other options include, most importantly, the incipit, or the opening words. And second, it's obviously not the case that a title must necessarily include the name of the author. There is, of course, no shortage of ancient works that were either identified via their incipit, or they had a title, but their author is not known. This includes, for example, several books of the Bible. And we can also see that before the surviving titles of the canonical Gospels were first used, other Gospel texts had titles that didn't include the author's name either. The Marcionite Gospel was just titled Evangelion, Good News, and Marcion didn't attribute it to any author. Irenaeus claims that the Valentinians titled a Gospel text the Gospel of Truth. Much later, we see the same phrase in the incipit of one Nag Hammadi text, which is lacking a title, by the way. And of course, other ancient Christians had no problem referring to Gospel texts without naming an author. For example, to the Gospel according to the Hebrews. The Dead Sea Scrolls community didn't seem to attach authors' names to their parabiblical writings either. They just used titles like the Community Rule. And many other Nag Hammadi texts don't have any known authors. Instead, they are just called the Exegesis of the Soul or the Wisdom of Jesus Christ. And there is actually some evidence that the canonical Gospels originally had these kinds of titles. Specifically, the first verse of the first chapter in the Gospel of Mark is not a sentence. it doesn't have any word. It says, Arche tu Evangeliu Jesu Christu, or the origin of the good news of Jesus the Messiah. That's a title. Similarly, the first verse of the first chapter in the Gospel of Matthew isn't a sentence. It says, Biblos Geneseos Jesu Christu, huiu David, huiu Abraham. Or the book of the origin of Jesus the Messiah, son of David, son of Abraham. That's a title. And we even see some evidence that before gospel titles were standardized in the 2nd century, the title of this anonymous book was unstable. The Didache, which I've already mentioned, refers to material appearing in the Gospel of Matthew, but it cites it as to Evangelion tu Kuriou Hemon, or the good news of our Lord. That's a title. Similarly, when Justin Martyr uses material which we can recognize in the canonical Gospels, he calls it apomnemoneumata ton apostolon, which is usually translated as apostolic memoirs. And he actually repeats this specific phrase so many times that some scholars think this is a book title. Apomnemoneumata is a technical term, and it appeared relatively frequently in book titles. For example, Xenophon famously wrote Apomnemoneumata Socratus, or memoirs about Socrates. What Justin is referring to might have been a gospel harmony or just a different mix of stories and sayings of Jesus, something like the Egerton Gospel or the recently published Oxyrhynchus Papyrus 5575, which includes material known from the Gospels of Matthew, Thomas, and Luke. This is because Justin uses material that isn't coming from any of the 4 canonical Gospels, and some of it also found its way into various apocryphal writings. For example, he says that Jesus was born in a cave, which we can also see, for example, in the infancy Gospel of James. He also gives a quotation of Jesus' words that doesn't appear in any of the 4 canonical Gospels. He quotes the voice from heaven heard during Jesus' baptism as reciting Psalm 2:7, which is also not in the 4 canonical Gospels, and stuff like that. And Justin never specifies that only some of his information about Jesus came from apostolic sources. For him, these are just other things that he knows about Jesus from, and I quote, apostles and those who followed them. Just to give you one example, Justin says, and I quote, when Jesus had gone to the river Jordan, where John was baptizing, and when he had stepped into the water, a fire was kindled in the Jordan. And when he came out of the water, the Holy Ghost lighted on him like a dove, as the apostles of this very Christ of ours wrote. Okay, so the Jordan River caught on fire. Where is this in the New Testament? Nowhere. And where else does it show up? Oh, for example, in the Gospel of the Ebionites. It's also interesting to note the difference between how Justin refers to these apostolic memoirs and how he refers to the book of Revelation. In the latter case, he identifies the author as, and I quote, a certain man with us, whose name was John, one of the apostles of Christ. Justin gives absolutely no indication that this John is also supposed to be one of the authors of these apostolic memoirs, and he never names the authors of these memoirs like he names the author of Revelation. And it's of course easy to explain this difference. Justin knew the name of the author of Revelation because the author of Revelation names himself in the text. Now, the obvious question is, if the Gospels were already differentiated by their incipits or by titles that didn't include the name of the author, why was this superseded by the currently used titles? And the answer lies in the specific title formula that was used. Various Gospels, and not just the 4 canonical Gospels, are titled using the Greek preposition kata plus a noun in the accusative case, so according to Philip or according to the Hebrews. In titles of ancient literary works, this specific formula was used for version control. It was used to differentiate between several existing versions of the same text. In all known instances, the formula was not applied by the author, but by someone else later. There are many different examples of this practice. The first is the poetry of Homer. Textual critical alterations of the works of Homer were done already by ancient readers. Most typically, some verses were excised because they were considered inauthentic. Different people, of course, had different ideas about what was inauthentic, which resulted in various different versions of the epics. So the formula was used to differentiate between these versions. Another example are medical texts. Owners of their manuscripts made, again, alterations to the text, for example, corrections, notes, and so on. Medical works were probably more susceptible to this because the genre is very practical. And again, the formula was then applied to differentiate between multiple versions of the same work produced by different manuscript owners. And last but not least, we also see it applied to differentiate between various Greek translations of books found in the Hebrew Bible. Now, I know that Michael thinks there's a valid counterexample to this in 2nd Maccabees, but there actually isn't. 2nd Maccabees includes a letter which mentions records according to Nehemiah. This is sometimes taken to be a reference to the biblical book of Nehemiah, but the letter is about Judas Maccabeus founding a library after the sacking of the Jerusalem temple by Antiochus Epiphanes. And it's clear from context that the records that are being referred to are books in the library that Nehemiah created, not the biblical book of Nehemiah. The reason why all 4 Gospels have titles with this specific formula is because at some point in the mid-2nd century, an editor, probably in Rome, collected the 4 Gospels and prepared them to be published together. And because the editor was aware that the 4 Gospels are very similar in terms of content, and in the case of the synoptics, they might, as well be regarded as 3 textual recensions of one literary work, he uniformly applied this formula to all 4 of them. The attribution to the 4 authors then became accepted in Rome. It spread from Rome through personal and literary contacts and through manuscript copying, and all extant references to the 4 authors, both in surviving manuscripts and in other literary works, result from this editorial decision. And just to be clear, that doesn't mean that the editor didn't honestly believe that the 4 names he chose were names of the actual authors. The point is that in all cases, when we see this formula being used in titles of ancient works, it's always applied by someone other than the author in order to differentiate between several already published and already circulating versions of the same text. So Mark sitting down and writing a text titled According to Mark would make about as much sense as writing a text titled First Maccabees. That's a label that was applied later. But if the existing titles were added later by an editor, that would be perfectly consistent with how that title formula is used everywhere else in ancient literature. There might be an additional indication that the titles are a product of an editorial decision. Many scholars, again including Christian scholars, argue that the Gospel according to Luke and the Acts of the Apostles are 2 books of a single 2-volume work. But volumes of the same literary work in antiquity usually had fairly uniform titles, something like Book 1 or the First Book. It seems that what happened in this case is that an editor took a 2-volume literary work, both written by and dedicated to one person, separated the 2 books, and gave the first book a title consistent with the other 3 Gospels. This resulted in the Gospel according to Luke and the Acts of the Apostles having 2 very different titles. Again, if the titles are original, this would be very anomalous, but if they are a product of a later editorial decision, they become entirely unsurprising.
So once again, folks, we want to be very careful with the notion that having titles on the Gospels is the same as knowing who the authors were and conflating those 2 things. Again, Dr. Gregor warned us about that earlier. We've talked about it previously, and it continues to kind of creep itself back into the conversation here. There are 2 different arguments here. The first argument, and the one that's most important, is did the people who were copying, reciting, circulating these Gospels know who originally wrote them? Did they know where they came from? That's the first question. And then the second question, which is of much less significance, is did they have the gospel attributions, the according to Matthew, according to Mark, according to Luke, according to John, attributions on them from the earliest days of their circulation? Those are 2 different questions. There's some overlap in the discussion, but they're really 2 distinct issues, and we have to make sure we do not lump them together. Because the issue here is that we know that the writers of the Gospels, the original accounts, were known, and they were known to a small group of people. It's not disputed. Nobody's disputing that. We also know specifically with Luke clearly knew the purported benefactor, Theophilus, arguably would have known, right? If that person was real and all of that. Again, there are arguments that are outside the scope of this. But if that person, Theophilus was a real person, that person would have known the writer, and Luke's gospel would have been distinguished automatically with that preamble from at least Matthew and Mark from the very beginning. Everybody would have known, oh, this one here that's dedicated to Theophilus, yeah, that's the different one. That's the one that comes from that whatever that other guy is. Maybe it's Luke or maybe it's something else. They would have known that's different. So the idea here that Luke would have necessarily had to have the title Gospel according to Luke in order for it to be disambiguated after Matthew and Mark had already been in circulation, we don't have to grant that. And that's what I think Professor Gregor is getting at. We're not obligated to assume that the only way to disambiguate would have been to have these kata titles. And in fact, we shouldn't assume that. I certainly do not assume that, and I think it's really too sloppy to kind of lump both of those issues together. That said, on the other side, I think it also goes too far to say that because those titles may or may not have been there from the beginning and not have been required, that those who were circulating these gospels didn't know where they came from originally. We've gotten nothing. There's not a single thing from the beginning of this discussion till now, given the concession that we got earlier, which is that these gospels were originally known. The writers of these gospels were originally known, at least to a small circle. We've got nothing to tell us why that wouldn't have continued to be the case. And so you can imagine that there would have been a scenario where at some point there was a need to separate out the gospels. Professor Gregor says that happened in the 2nd century when again, it's a hypothetical that he's putting together. So I don't want to, tear down a straw man here, but his hypothetical is that there was a 2nd century historian, likely a Roman or compiler, a 2nd century compiler, likely a Roman, who compiled all 4 gospels together into one work and needed a way to distinguish them. And so he applied these titles, these kata titles, according to titles, to each of the gospels, and that's when it first happened. Again, that's his theory. There's nothing that's been presented that compels us to believe that. It's not the best theory, even on the evidence that's being presented to us here, but it's fair. Because if the argument is there would have been a need to disambiguate these titles at that point, Michael's argument and arguments from others would be, well, that we agree, but that point was earlier, much earlier, sometime in the 1st century. And there's really nothing that's been given to tell us that would be otherwise. We're going to discuss some of the reasons why I think that's the better argument as between the two, given some of the other issues here, particularly the issue around the Gospel of John. But for now, our question is, at what point did the knowledge of the writers of the Gospels go from being known by the people who were copying them to being forgotten and lost to those in the next century? When did that happen and why? The better argument is that it never happened. It doesn't really line up with anything that we've been given so far. So I'll go ahead and concede that it's possible that the earliest Gospels, as they were circulating, didn't have the kata titles on them. In fact, I'll more than concede it for the purposes of this discussion. I'll go ahead and grant that I think that's the more likely answer here, given the presentation by Professor Gregor. I think it's the better argument, given the evidence that he's put forth, that those titles weren't on the original circulating documents. I will grant that. I think that's the better argument. I think if we're doing this right, we have to be fair when we see good arguments. Again, that's why I think Professor Gregor's work is so compelling, because had the evidence not been provided, I would have thrown that argument away. But the evidence that he provided has persuaded me. Again, I was already somewhat here, but it's persuaded me even further that the titles may not have been on the earliest of manuscripts. They're on all the surviving manuscripts, and that's a fair point. So we actually don't have manuscript evidence for this point. To be fair, we don't have manuscript evidence for this point. But as Professor Gregor argues, that may not be as big of a deal as we think it is. Nonetheless, it does cut in the other direction, and we have to be fair about that. But with all that said, I think this is where the benefit of a historian who is thorough and is precise and digs in can be persuasive and be more persuasive than a layperson. So I'm now persuaded more than I was that the Gospels may not have circulated from the very beginning with the according to attributions. So I'm going to concede that for this conversation, and probably is how I'll argue this going forward. Now, that's a totally different point from whether or not the people who were circulating and reading these Gospels knew that it came from, again, Matthew or Mark or Luke. And I think the argument for that is much stronger than the argument against it. All right, so we need to deal with this issue of the kind of earliest church historians, Justin Martyr, Ignatius, Papias, so early Christians, early church historians who appear to be, I think, with everyone's concession, writing about things that appear to be what we now know as the Gospels. And the question is, did they have access to the Gospels that, as we know them today? Was there some rudimentary thing? Was it just oral tradition, folklore? You know, there are all kinds of explanations for that. But I think what we have to deal with here is the argument that is being put forth by Dr. Gregor here is that, for example, with Justin Martyr, he does not reference Gospels by name. He doesn't say the Gospel according to Matthew when he writes out passages that appear to come from Matthew, for example. And so, again, with the precision that we're approaching this conversation with, we now know that by itself does not mean that the Gospel wasn't known to Justin Martyr as being a Gospel that originated from Matthew. We're going to concede, and this is the other side of the concession, right? This is an important. If we're going to concede the one side, this is the other side of it. So we're going to concede that the kata attributions weren't on the Gospels until some later point, perhaps a point after the time of Justin Martyr. We'll concede that. But then the flip side of that is that we shouldn't expect then for Justin Martyr to reference the Gospels with the kata, the according to Matthew, according to Mark titles. We shouldn't expect that. And that doesn't tell us anything once we've given that concession. Because, again, the question is, did Justin Martyr know, A, that gospel was otherwise authoritative, right? Did he have the gospel, right? That's question number one, but we're going to accept that for now. And did he know it was authoritative, and did he know where it came from? And the absence of the title does, as we've said many times, doesn't tell us that he didn't. It doesn't give us any reason to believe that he didn't know. And so we'll go ahead and accept that, because I think that is as far as we can go here. We'll go ahead and accept that when Justin Martyr got these Gospels, they didn't have the kata attributions there. But we cannot say more than that, I think, at this point. But that's not even the most interesting question, because the argument here is that that's intentionally or unintentionally conflated by different people. Not saying it's Dr. Gregor, that the absence of those titles means that the writers or the historians who were writing about these documents in the 2nd century didn't know where they came from, who they were. As we've said many times, that's not been established. And so there's a real challenge with this disambiguation theory, this theory that a 2nd century historian or compiler needed to compile the 4 Gospels into a single account, and in order to distinguish them, had to have a way of distinguishing them, and so assigned the kata attributions to them according to John, according to Matthew, etc., to the Gospels as a way of distinguishing them. And then that was the first time that those titles became appended. We've already conceded that the titles may not have been on the documents prior to that. We'll just accept that. This argument really struggles, I think, to make the point that Professor Gregor is trying to use it for. And actually, in my assessment of the evidence, cuts in the other direction. Because if the purpose was to disambiguate, Professor Gregor goes to great detail about all of the confusion around John, who John was. Was John the writer of the Gospel according to John? Was it John the son of Zebedee? Was it John the elder? Perhaps John who's purported to have written the book of Revelation, and maybe they're the same people, maybe they're not. All of that confusion was present relatively early within the church. Second century for sure. After that, and so the choice of someone in the second century saying, "I'm going to help resolve the confusion around these gospels, so I'm going to pick this really generic name that is confusing, and that even within our sort of church history and tradition, and even in the gospels, has multiple people associated with it. I'm going to choose this really generic name as the name to disambiguate this gospel by." I struggle to accept that. I think that is a weak argument. I think what is actually the better assessment is that name John was associated with that gospel from a much earlier period. Otherwise, there'd be no reason for a second century compiler to choose that name. It would be like going to Vietnam and saying the gospel according to Nguyen, or South Korea, the gospel according to Kim, or United States, the gospel according to Smith. I mean, to choose a generic, very, very common name that does nothing to disambiguate is an odd choice. We really have to ask ourselves, why would that be the choice if that name was not there from the earliest days? And so now that leaves us with the question, because we know, as we've said, that from the earliest days, at the very inception of each gospel, it was known to a small community who the writer was. So the question for us now is, did that persist down the line? And one could see how a gospel according to Matthew could persist without confusion from the time it was written to the second century. Gospel according to Mark. Again, Mark and Luke are odd choices in and of themselves as choices to assign to these gospels for a number of reasons. Again, there's some good reasons that have been given for it. There are good reasons against it, but they'd be odd choices. I think if we're fair to choose, if those weren't what the legends were from the earliest days. So, be that as it may, you have Matthew. You can see how that could persist down through the ages, through the first century for sure, to the second century. Mark could persist down. Luke could persist. Again, these are not these ones would not be nearly as challenging, and people could look at them and people could say, "Oh, Luke, that's the one, right? That's the one that has that lead-in thing where he talks about the witness and stuff. Okay, that's Luke. Yeah, you're right." And then you get John, right? And John is its own gospel. Lots of, outside the scope of this conversation, stories about that gospel, when it came from, what its purpose was, and everything else. But even John, you could see how that could have been known at the early days. Hey, who wrote this? It was John. Okay, that was known to a small group. They pass it down. It was John. Then he goes to the next group and say it was John. By the time you get to the 80s, 90s, 100s, 110s, everyone knows it's John. But what's been lost now is, because unlike these other gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, which John? And especially as we're talking about people who are further removed from the events themselves, which John are we talking about? Is it John, the son of Zebedee? Was it other John? That one guy that used to hang around those Jesus follower guys. Remember that one John guy? Was it him? It's much harder. And when we get to the point where we look at the second century writers, Irenaeus, and certainly by the time we're talking about Origen and Augustine and others, we're at the point now where there was, Eusebius, and potentially what survives of Papias and all that. We're at the point now where there's genuine confusion about which John. And so it would not have helped to assign John as a means of disambiguating. Again, you could have assigned any name and it would have made it different from the other three. I'm not arguing that. What I'm saying is, but to choose the name John as that choice would be odd. The better argument, and I think in this case it's much, much, much better, is that John is a legacy name from much earlier days that persisted down, and while people remembered that it was John, by the time it got to the point of the second century historians who were writing this, they weren't entirely sure which John it was. And again, to be clear, it's not clear that they weren't sure. It's not clear, for example, for Irenaeus, that he was confused. Irenaeus believes it was the Apostle John, and we can't assume that he was confused about that. But if the argument is that he was confused about it, and there was a whole debate about it, it's still the better argument that name must have persisted with that gospel, at least orally in terms of legend, from its very earliest days.
Attached to them. For example, the prologue of Luke's Gospel indicates it was sent to someone named Theophilus. It is inconceivable the Gospel would have been sent to him without Theophilus knowing who wrote and sent him a copy of a Gospel. It is unlikely he would have just received some anonymous text and considered it authoritative without knowing it came from someone like Luke. As Richard Bauckham said, the author's name would have featured in an original title, but in any case, would have been known to the dedicatee and other first readers because the author would have presented the book to the dedicatee.
Okay, let me tell you an anecdote from Plutarch to make a point. When Julius Caesar was becoming increasingly unpopular, people in Rome started thinking that, it would be a good idea for him to retire to a farm in upstate Italy. And they started encouraging Marcus Brutus, believed to be descended from Lucius Brutus, who drove out the last tyrannical king of Rome, to, do something about Caesar, which he did by murdering him. But because it wasn't exactly possible to incite him to a political assassination openly, scrolls with political slogans started conspicuously showing up in places where Brutus was likely to randomly find them. These scrolls were turbo-anonymous. Nobody, apart from their writers, not even their moms, knew who wrote them. No scholar proposes that the Gospels were originally anonymous like that. Of course, there were initially people who knew who the Gospel authors were, just like there were people who initially knew who wrote the Epistle to the Hebrews. What's your point? Of course, there were people who knew who wrote the Didache or the letter to Diognetus. We don't. That happens all the time. What I'm arguing is that already in mid-2nd century, Christians had no better idea about who wrote the 4 Gospels than we do today, just like they didn't know who wrote Hebrews.
Third, when we study the early church writings, we can see there is unanimous agreement among a multitude of witnesses. All agree the Gospels came from Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. There are none that dissent and attribute them to other authors. Even early copies of the Gospels that have survived, that still have a title, attribute them to their respected authors. No Gospel manuscript has ever been found that bears a different name.
This is, again, entirely correct. We also don't have any manuscripts which we would positively know didn't have any title. You, Paul, mentioned P1, which is a fragment of a codex sleeve, most likely from the 3rd century. It has a chapter number above the text of Matthew 1:1, but no title is extant. But this doesn't necessarily mean that no title was present. As far as I know, for example, Bart Ehrman thinks that it had a title above the chapter number in the portion of the manuscript which is unfortunately not preserved. Much more interesting is P66, one of the earliest, if not the earliest surviving manuscript with a gospel title. It's been actually suggested that the title, in this case Gospel according to John, was added later, and so the manuscript originally didn't have it. When the manuscript evidence is debated, people are quick to point out that we are missing manuscripts with titles before late 2nd century, which is, and I'm sure this is a complete coincidence, also when we start getting literary attestation to the surviving gospel titles. But today, I want to emphasize that for a much longer period of time, we are only looking at the manuscript evidence through an incredibly tiny keyhole. There are only 4 surviving manuscript fragments with gospel titles and with the most probable date before the year 350. P66, which I've already mentioned before, P75 and P62. And here's a map showing all the locations that these manuscripts came from. As you can see, it's all clustered in the same part of Egypt. Manuscript evidence tells us nothing about how the Gospels were titled, say, in Spain or in Armenia. And what's also very unfortunate, but not for me, is that we also happened to have a very early manuscript of Irenaeus' Against Heresies, the first literary work which names the 4 traditional Gospel authors found in Egypt. This is Oxyrhynchus Papyrus 405, dated to about the year 200, so contemporary or even earlier than the only 4 manuscripts with Gospel titles. This one papyrus of Irenaeus' work largely invalidates even this meager evidence from the 4 Egyptian manuscripts, because we can conclusively show that the only region from which we have early manuscripts with Gospel titles is also a region where the first book naming the traditional authors was read, and around the same time. Only much later, we start getting some geographic variability with some of the major codices, Sinaiticus, Vaticanus, and Bezae for Greek, and Bezae and Vercellensis for Latin. But these were produced well after Constantine's conversion, when everyone and their mother already thought they knew who the Gospel authors were. Just to put this into perspective, these late manuscripts are contemporary or even later than, for example, the Nag Hammadi texts, with titles like According to Philip or According to Thomas. We only start getting more manuscripts with titles in Latin, Syriac, and Coptic in 4th and 5th centuries, literally hundreds of years after the surviving titles were first used. I would also like to point out that on numerous other occasions, Christian apologists invite us to imagine that early Christian communities were incredibly closely knit and well connected, so that, for example, if a member of the Corinthian church had any doubts about Paul saying that Jesus once appeared to 500 brethren at the same time, they were apparently able to hop on a ship, travel to somewhere, Palestine, I guess, get in touch with one of the surviving brethren and fact-check Paul. Or we are invited to believe that if someone, say in Gaul, invented a healing miracle of Jesus, they would eventually get a personal visit from Simon the Canaanite or a strongly worded letter signed the other apostle Judas, not Iscariot. Let's assume that this is true. In that case, it's not surprising that a piece of information which had literal centuries to propagate would eventually show up in several different regions of the Mediterranean.
It is important to note that this unanimous attestation comes from across the whole Roman world, and not simply one region. Multiple authors from different regions all agree the 4 gospel authors are Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But perhaps a skeptic could argue they all got their information from the same source before it spread out. Even if this was true, given that we have cited many 2nd century sources, the original point of the tradition must have been early, for it to have become such a widespread tradition by the 2nd century, meaning it likely originated in the 1st century, when the gospels were being composed.
Let's move to claims about gospel authorship in ancient Christian texts. I think this is a much less poor type of evidence than manuscripts, because there's, strictly speaking, more of it. Also, in the case of literary attestation, we actually do get some geographic variability earlier. It's not all limited to like 2 towns in Egypt. There are, however, broadly speaking, 3 types of issues with literary attestation: issues with independence, issues with uniformity, and issues with reliability. Let's start with issues with independence. The 4 traditional gospel authors not only appear in titles of surviving manuscripts, but they are also spoken of by various ancient Christian authors. But to what extent are these attestations mutually independent? Is it really true that the same identification of the authors pops into existence separately all around the Mediterranean? What you're seeing on your screen right now is a stemma of literary authors who mentioned Mark being a gospel author before the Council of Nicaea. You know, the council which famously did not vote about which Gospels should be included in the New Testament, that decision was actually made by an unknown editor in mid-2nd century. And I'm showing the stemma of Mark because it's the earliest Gospel, and so it had the most time to accumulate attestation. As you can see, these authors are connected. They are connected either through literary dependence, for example, the anonymous work Refutation of All Heresies, falsely attributed to Hippolytus, quotes from Against Heresies by Irenaeus, or they are connected through discipleship. For example, Dionysius of Alexandria studied under Origen of Alexandria, and so on. To my knowledge, what you're seeing on your screen right now are all the known authors who identify Mark as a gospel writer in ante-Nicene literature. Apart from these, the Markan authorship is only mentioned in this period in 3 anonymous texts: a polemical treatise on the rebaptism of apostates after the Decian persecution in the 3rd century, and the so-called anti-Marcionite and monarchian prologue to the Gospel of Mark, preserved in some manuscripts of the Vulgate. The date and sources behind the Gospel prologues are difficult to determine, and I've seen dates ranging from the 2nd to the 6th century. The anti-Marcionite prologues are generally considered earlier, and based on verbal agreement, it's been suggested that they are either dependent on Irenaeus or on the same tradition, which is cited by Papias. It's also interesting to note that almost all these authors either lived in Rome at some point, or they exchanged letters with Christians in Rome. Both the Refutation of All Heresies, the Anti-Marcionite, and the Monarchian Prologues were, in all likelihood, also written in Rome. And this is no coincidence. Rome is the most likely location where the surviving gospel titles originate from. They didn't appear independently in many different locations throughout the world. It goes back to an edition of the 4 Gospels published in Rome at some point in the mid-2nd century, and from there it spread through personal and literary contacts to other Christian communities, for example in Alexandria or Carthage.
But also, when we study the traditions, we see variation. Irenaeus and later church fathers suggest the order the Gospels were written in was Matthew first, followed by Mark, then Luke, and then John. But Clement of Alexandria believed Matthew and Luke were written first, then Mark, and then John. So it appears they had different traditions regarding the order the Gospels were written in, which shows us their information was not all coming from the same source. And despite this, we still have unanimous agreement on who the Gospel authors were.
So, just to reiterate, Irenaeus and Clement of Alexandria contradict each other when it comes to the order in which the 4 canonical Gospels were written, and this is not the only quote-unquote variation between them. Irenaeus also says that the Gospel of Mark was written only after Peter died, and I think that Irenaeus believed that because, and I agree with him on this is the natural reading of what Papias says about Mark's literary activity, i.e. that Mark wrote down whatsoever he remembered from the teachings of Peter. But Clement actually claims that Mark wrote the Gospel when Peter was still alive and that Peter knew about it. Clement reportedly wrote about this in his work called Hypotyposes, which I've seen translated as outlines. But that work is lost. We only have fragments, mostly in Eusebius. And Eusebius was nice enough to preserve not only what Clement wrote, but also who his sources were. Eusebius says, and I quote, "Clement gives the tradition of the earliest presbyters as to the order of the Gospels. Unfortunately, we don't know who these presbyters are supposed to be. Several candidates have been suggested, but this is where the trail goes cold." Clement, citing a prior source, paradoxically makes the problem worse, because it pushes it further back in time. Normally, you'd think that getting contradictory answers to the same question from contemporary authors should lower your confidence that they have reliable information. But not according to Michael, apparently. I should note that there seems to be something wrong going on with the passage, because Eusebius actually brings it up twice in his ecclesiastical history, and what he says on the 2 occasions contradicts. In Book 2, he says that when Peter learned about Mark writing the Gospel, Peter, and I quote, was pleased with the zeal of the man, and the work obtained the sanction of his authority for the purpose of being used in the churches. But in Book 6, he says that when Peter learned about it, and I quote, he neither directly forbade nor encouraged it. There's a couple of things that might be going on here. Maybe Eusebius is just quoting from memory. Maybe he's confusing Clement with a different author, which wouldn't be unprecedented for Eusebius. Or maybe he's just citation bluffing, which was relatively common in antiquity. It's hard to say more, given that Clement's hypotyposes are lost. I personally think and this is just my own speculation, that the two contradictory accounts about the authorship of Mark are not only coming from the same sources, but one is actually an apologetic reaction to the other. The idea that Mark wrote down Peter's preaching only after Peter's death, when Peter was no longer around to sanction it, caused concerns about the Gospel's reliability, and so the Gospel was redated to close off that possibility. Kind of like the author of the Gospel of Matthew invented the story about the guards at Joseph's tomb to combat the body theft hypothesis. And
All right, so I don't think we need to spend too much time on this because we've covered some of this earlier. For example, we started at the outset with the really important admission that the original writers of the gospel accounts would have known who wrote them, and a small community of people around them who would have known that as well. That's conceded. No one is arguing that. So I think the broad point is, at least with respect to that, is something we can move on from. And then there's some of this other discussion about the strength and the value of the patristic record. And there's a lot of discussion there. I really don't want to get into it too much because I'm not sure that it will help us one way or the other in terms of solidifying a position or maybe coming off of a position. But here's what I will say, at least with respect to the chart that was put up that showed Clement of Alexandria as being dependent on Irenaeus. That is contradicted by what Dr. Gregor says later, in that even in the preserved testimony that we have from Eusebius regarding Clement of Alexandria, he doesn't identify which presbyters and elders and eyewitnesses he relied on. There's nothing that I'm aware of that directly links Irenaeus to Clement of Alexandria. And I think what the argument Michael's making, which was caricatured here a little bit, probably more than it should have been, is that it does appear, at least in the accounts that we'll concede for now, disagree with each other between Clement and Irenaeus. Actually, it's worth saying, at least with respect to the order of the Gospels, it's not a disagreement. If you look at the language closely between Irenaeus and Clement, this is a bit of a sidebar, but Clement testifies that the Gospels with the genealogies came first, and then he talks about Mark, and there's others who've analyzed, what that means. Irenaeus says things slightly differently. Irenaeus says that Matthew issued the gospel first, and that after Matthew, Mark issued a gospel, and Luke also issued a gospel, and afterwards John. I'm summarizing, but that's the basic order. So Irenaeus doesn't specifically say whether Mark came before Luke or Luke came before Mark. He's very clear that they're both after Matthew. But the point is that the additional set of facts that we get from Clement, which is that the Gospels, the genealogies came first, is important to the argument that it indicates that it's a different tradition than the tradition that Irenaeus is relying on. So Clement of Alexandria's position that the Gospels, the genealogies came first, is different from Irenaeus's tradition. This is important. If the question is, does this confirm that there's absolute 100% accuracy? No, it doesn't. It doesn't argue against it. Doesn't argue for it. But if the argument is that everything we know about the early church fathers, the patristic record from the 2nd century, is all identifiable to a single source, this evidence cuts against that. And I think that's the point that's being made here, that's being somewhat caricatured unfairly, in my view. Like this evidence cuts against that for a couple of reasons. Again, the two being that the facts appear to be different, and then we don't have anything in the record that's preserved that says that Clement of Alexandria got his information from Irenaeus or Papias. Okay, folks, so there's more we can say here. This video is already, pushing 2 hours, maybe a little bit past that, and there's some stuff we haven't covered, largely focusing on the period of the second century and beyond. It's a good discussion. It's worth watching. As I said, if you care about this topic, you need to watch the entire video from Dr. Gregor. I'll say it again. He's fantastic. He gives evidence. He has solid basis behind the arguments he makes. You see here, we don't agree on the interpretation of that evidence, but I think his arguments are fair. I hope, again, I don't know, I hope there would be some concession that the arguments that I've made here are also fair on the other side. I think wherever you are on this issue, you're unlikely to be dug out by the arguments that are put forth on either side of this. I think you're likely are where you are. So especially the people who spend time on this. So this is really more for the as I said, for the seeker, for the person who's confused, is just getting introduced to this, doesn't know where they stand on things. That's who I'm focused on. But please watch the entire video. Put it on, do some housekeeping, do some errands. Listen to it in the car. It is really worth listening to the whole thing, because this is what we want. It's what we insist on getting from biblical scholars. And again, for me, the bar has been raised now, because I will not accept anything left in this when an argument's presented from a biblical scholar. I think it's fair, because I think this is what we should, those who are outside of the field and are the field is trying to persuade us on a point of view from within the field, we're owed the evidence that they relied on. And if you can't explain it to us, and it's too complicated, and you have to be, you have to have gone through and gotten the PhD and everything else in order to understand it, then that's a you problem. You need to do better than that if you want your arguments to be taken seriously by anyone outside of your field. And I can tell you right now, I cannot take most of the arguments that I've covered in other videos seriously, that outside of this, as an outsider to the field. So if they don't care about that, if you just want to stay in a bubble and have your arguments circulate amongst yourselves and praise each other, great. But if you want your field to have any relevance or validity to those outside of it, and you should want that as an academic, more needs to be done. And I think the bar is the bar that we get here from Dr. Gregor. So I want to make that point. And then I'll just close on this. As I looked at this, there's some things that I took away from it that I think were valuable. One is very compelling argument that the gospel attributions, the kata attributions, according to Matthew, according to Mark, according to Luke, may not have circulated with the texts from the very beginning. I think there's compelling evidence that that's true. And the manuscript evidence, again, cuts against it. Some other things cut against it. But there's compelling evidence that it's true. And I think it's a point that's worth conceding, given that evidence. However, I think that there are, it doesn't mean, as conceded, that no one knew who the writers of the Gospels were. And I think that's the big argument. That's how this argument's used by skeptics, particularly less sophisticated skeptics than Dr. Gregor. That's how this argument is often used. And that's not what Dr. Gregor's arguing at all. And I think he would agree that that is not the argument he's taking. Even if he personally has come to that position based on this evidence, I don't believe he would argue that we're compelled to that position simply because the titles didn't appear in the documents until the 2nd century. So that's one point. Another issue here that I think is worth sort of noodling on and thinking about is the internal lack of identification in the Gospels of either eyewitness testimony as this being an account from an eyewitness, or as this being written by a specific named author. The significance of that, again, is not that no one knew who wrote these. That's not the argument. But what it is significant for is that if you're going to place these documents in the category of historical bibliography or historical biography, you're on shaky ground doing that, because you will be an outlier compared to comparable texts from the period that are true historical biographies. I think this is another great point. I've personally not been one to place the documents that way. I've long held, and I think it is the better argument, and I imagine there'd be very little pushback, that whatever the Gospels are, they are unique. Even if they're broadly in the category of history, they are a unique set of documents, particularly from antiquity, with respect to any other historical document. I think the question that remains largely unanswered from this analysis is the question of, why should we concede that the gospel writers' identities were once known but then forgotten by the time we get to the 2nd century? At least Matthew, Mark, and Luke, there's really nothing that's been established that compels us to that position. And honestly, I think the better point of view by far, I don't think this one is even really that close, is that that knowledge, whatever it was, stuck with those 3 gospels at least, up through the time that the original attributions were placed on them, whenever that was. And I do believe, and I agree, and I think it's fair that there was a point that came where the documents needed to be disambiguated. The question is whether that was early, earlier, in the 1st century, or whether that was in the 2nd century. But at some point that needed to happen. There was some other discussion about, which I think we should concede, that we don't have to assume that the only way to disambiguate is with a title, particularly with a title that has a name in it. According to Mark, according to Matthew, I think that's fair. I think that's a great point. There may be things within the titles, the first sentences themselves. This was talked about. We didn't cover it here, but there may be things within the first sentence that give us a clue. I think certainly with respect to the ones in Matthew and Mark, I don't think there's anything that clearly lays out from the first sentence of either of those gospels what the rest of the account is going to be about. Matthew launches right into a genealogy, but the account covers far more than that. So, small point, side point, but I think it's something to think about. And then I think, just to wrap up here, the last bit of this is that what we're trying to get at ultimately, and what we care about, as I said at the very beginning, is the truth. That's what we care about. We care about the truth. And so in this case, the question here is, did this happen? Is this real? And we're looking to authorship as a way to help us understand that. But fundamentally, the question that we're asking is this real? Are these accounts something we can rely on as history, at least as it concerns the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ? And we know some of that is not going to be granted because it's supernatural and shouldn't be granted, at least in the level that we're having a conversation now, where we're just focusing on the natural elements, and the verifiable historical elements shouldn't be granted. But again, we're trying to get to the truth. The point here is we want to know how much of this is real. And that's why another takeaway from this here is going to be, going forward, we cannot allow the skeptic, the atheist, to argue, oh, the gospel circulated anonymously until the 2nd century. No one knew who wrote them. That argument is gone. This video kills that argument. If you want to make that argument after this, you're out in left field. It's the weakest of the arguments that can be made from the evidence here. So that's really important. Doesn't mean that we're able to say definitively that we do know who wrote the Gospels, but if you're going to argue that the absence of the titles, in the 1st century means that no one knew who wrote these Gospels, that's already been conceded as false. You can't argue that. And if you want to argue that it was known and forgotten, there's more work that needs to be done. So we'll sort of wrap up here with that. I'll ask you guys to, if you can, please like and subscribe. It helps me a lot. Doesn't really cost you anything at all. I hope you find this content valuable. I try to be fair. I try to be balanced. I try to give you guys the facts as I see them, do the analysis in a way that I think is as neutral as possible. If I have a bias, I'm clear about it. So I hope you guys enjoy that. I hope you find that useful to you. And I just thank you for your time.